My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and if you're watching this on release day, then it is March 25th, 2021, which is Tolkien Reading Day. And this year, the Tolkien Society decided that their theme for Tolkien Reading Day was going to be hope and courage. So the group of YouTubers that I'm associated with that all love and discuss Tolkien all the time decided, hey, why don't we kind of join in on that theme and do another collaboration? So I've already done a video earlier this year on the theme of hope, and I did that in a video on the topic of Amdir and Estel, the two Elvish words for hope, and how they kind of play out in characters in the Lord of the Rings. You can watch that. I'll link to it in the description below. So in this video, I wanted to go the courage route, and specifically what I want to talk about is this weird contrast that we seem to get in the story of why it is that the Nazgul inspire terror in pretty much literally everybody. And yet in the Shire, most of the hobbits they interact with seem to be relatively unfazed. So I'm going to look at the instances that we get that show how the Nazgul usually make people feel, contrast that with how we get some hobbits, and explore why this might be. So let's take a look. So the first thing to note, of course, is that the Nazgul almost invariably really cause terror in whoever they come across. And we can see this in, Bree, we can see it in stories that Gandalf and Boromir tell at the Council of Elrond. We can see it pretty much anywhere we hear anything about the Nazgul at all. We get numerous instances throughout the stories of, just a Nazgul flying overhead in the distance and sometimes not even visible because they're so far up, but whoever is underneath them, whether the whole fellowship or just Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, they'll feel a chill, like that's, something's off, something's not good. We can see this too, in a lot of other instances in like the stories that Gandalf and Boromir were telling. For instance, Gandalf in the council tells that whenever he's riding south to meet Saruman, and even before that, I think, he runs across a bunch of refugees heading north, upon whom sat a fear that they weren't really willing to talk about. And he's like, what is wrong with these people? And then when he finds out from Radagast that the Nine are abroad, he's like, oops, that's why. Boromir tells of the assault on Osgiliath, which preceded his trip north to Rivendell, and how nobody could stand against what we presume is the Witch King, which is, he just describes it as a horseman robed in black, in the night, and it's just one as far as Boromir describes it. And so there's this terror that goes before him that basically causes even the bravest in Gondor to, blanch and run away. So there's all these different instances where the Nazgul just cause abject fear. And of course, we see this the most in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields and stuff like that, because we do get, and they're certainly doing their darndest to absolutely destroy the morale of the people in Minas Tirith. But there's just instance after instance after instance. But on the other hand, we have instances of them interacting with hobbits in the Shire where there doesn't really seem to be a lot of that going on. So for instance, when they talk to Gaffer Gamgee, which is right at the same time Frodo is leaving the Shire, we get Gaffer kind of just having a conversation with the Black Rider, and Frodo overhears part of it, and the conversation seems relatively normal. He says that, it tells us in the narrative that the Gaffer's voice seems a little bit, high strung, almost like there's something stressing him out, but we don't get the impression that he's just like cowering in fear. Later on, we'll get another story from Farmer Maggot, who comes off even better than the Gaffer, at least as far as, Maggot tells the story, which, maybe he's embellishing his own end of it, but I don't think we have any reason to believe that. So, but when he tells the story to Sam, Pippin, and Frodo, he basically says, this rider comes up and the dogs are acting all scared, and certainly there was something weird about him, but anyway, he has the conversation with him and he basically tells him off and says, get out of here, you're on my land. And even when the Black Rider offers him gold for information, he's like, you ain't coming back, get out of here, I'll sick the dogs on you. So certainly there's seems to be something different about what's going on in the Shire. Now, there's also the couple of instances where the Black Riders will get close to Frodo as they're hunting him, and Frodo will feel fear and he'll have a really strong desire to put on the ring, but it's not clear that that's really a illustrative example because Frodo has the ring. And so it's not really clearly the same thing. The only other instance we directly get of a hobbit in the Shire directly interacting, or very nearly directly interacting, with the Nazgul is Fatty Bulger, who, when the hobbits are off in Bree, he gets attacked by the Nazgul at the house at Crickhollow. And he ends up running for his life, and when he gets somewhere, he basically is collapsed in a hysterical heap. But there again, I don't think that's a very good example, because what precedes that is three of the Nazgul are like camped outside of the house at Crickhollow, and they're just waiting for their moment to strike, and so they're building fear the whole time. And Fatty Bulger is not exactly the bravest hobbit to begin with. He's the one who stayed behind because he was mortally afraid of entering the old forest. So again, I don't think we can really count him as an example. So that's kind of the contrast between what normally happens with Nazgul and what happens with hobbits in the Shire for whatever reason we don't know. Now let's take a look at reasons why this might be a significant difference. So one of the things that Aragorn will tell the hobbits once they meet him is the nine are stronger when they're gathered together, and they're also stronger in the dark. And we will also find out, I believe from Gandalf, I forget exactly where this is, but he'll, give the idea that they're actually more terrifying when they're not cloaked. If they're just invisible, they're even more terrifying than normal. Aragorn also implies in what he says that they'll probably be more terrifying out in the wild, where you're far from hope and far from any chance of rescue, which it's not exactly clear if that's something that's just natural to the Nazgul, or if it's just the fact that it's like, you don't have anything else to rely on, and so naturally you're just more afraid of anything that might be, a threat. So there's some technical stuff there that might explain some of it, because in the instances we see in the Shire, it's one Nazgul interacting with one hobbit, and they're in, not like a bustling town necessarily, because Maggot is kind of off on his own, but certainly not in the wild and far from help. So you could look at those factors and kind of explain it. And also, neither of the Nazgul interact with these hobbits at night, except, again, Fatty Bulger. So that would partially explain the difference there. But the factors that that matter here, there's only one Nazgul at a time. It's not at night, and they're in the middle of cultivated land, at least, even if not, like a suburban region. Those factors do tend to explain it, but they don't really seem to completely explain it, because again, you've got the Nazgul floating above the city of Minas Tirith, which is, very much not, the wild, and it's not, it's dark because the clouds, but it's not necessarily nighttime. And it certainly, with the attack on Osgiliath, that might have been at night, but it was only apparently one of the Nazgul. And again, these people are all together, and it may not be a city anymore because it's not really inhabited, but they've got kind of their own community. So this doesn't really seem to completely explain everything, but what I think does have a powerful impact on all this is one of the things that Gandalf will later say, and that is that there is a power too of a sort in the Shire. And this is a really amorphous remark. He doesn't really get into an explanation of what exactly he means, but I think this has a lot to do with this phenomenon that we experience in the Lord of the Rings. And so this is where I want to spend a lot of time exploring what exactly that power might be and where it comes from. So first, let's take a look at some of the things that do make the Shire different. And here we can go all the way back to The Hobbit, because at the very end of The Hobbit, as Thorin is on his deathbed, he will tell Bilbo, if more of us valued food and cheer and song over hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. And he calls Bilbo the child of the kindly West. And certainly the Shire is very much in this kind of vein. It is different than almost any other place that we set foot in Middle-earth, because the hobbits of the Shire really just want their peace, and they want to enjoy, the simple comforts of a decent life. And they have no ambition. They don't want glory. They don't want, conquest or anything like this. They're just happy to live out their peaceful little lives. And that does really set them apart. Now, another aspect of this is, and here we can look at Tolkien's Christian faith and compare Thorin, his remark, to the Beatitudes that Jesus delivers on the Mount, because Jesus will say, blessed are the poor, and especially blessed are the poor in spirit. And he's giving all these kinds of things that would, in almost any pagan context, seem like a complete non sequitur. It's like, why would you be better off, being poor or being, sad, or, all these things? But the fact that he says, blessed are the poor and whatnot, it's really interesting, because the hobbits, while they're relatively prosperous, certainly could not be described as wealthy. Certain of the hobbits could be described that way, but they're not like the dwarves who, mined and gained great, fabulous wealth by digging up gold and jewels and mithril in certain cases in the mountains. They also don't have the kind of wealth that Gondor or Arnor had as being great kingdoms, descendants of Numenor and all that sort of thing. Even in, pre-colonial era Numenor was a pretty wealthy society because it was just that great. And so they're very different in that respect. And I think these kind of inform Tolkien's view of how the hobbits relate to the rest of the world. And it's not obvious why at first, but I think if we look at it, the hobbits, to the extent that they are prosperous mainly in that, they're not poor in the sense of abject poverty, although Tolkien does tell us every now and then you will find some that are pretty poor. And you even have some hobbits that are just vagabonds that just literally dig a hole in the ground and use that as a home. But by and large, the hobbits of the Shire, at least, are not poor in that sense, but they're poorer in the sense that they don't have great wealth. To the extent even that Bilbo had great wealth, it was kind of a lucky thing because he made off with a bunch of treasure from, not the Dragon Horde. He ended up taking, the Dragon Horde. He ended up taking some money from the Dragon Horde as payment for his services. And there are other families that seem to have kind of gotten wealth in similar ways, but most of them are farmers or simple tradesmen. And so none of them are going to have a huge amount of wealth. And it's very rare to find a very poor hobbit, but it's also pretty rare to find like a landed gentry type of hobbit. And most of those have kind of inherited wealth from a lot of these adventures, it seems. Or even not, if not, it's just the kind of wealth you get from doing really well with your land. It's not the kind of wealth you get from plundering dragon hordes on a routine basis, which is pretty rare even outside the Shire. So the hobbits aren't like extraordinarily wealthy. Some of them are wealthy enough to be comfortable without having to do work, but that's even rare among the hobbits. Most of them, like I say, are farmers. And so most of what the hobbits have are their home, their family, and, the land they work on, which, the land may be their farm. It may be the land that they have their, tradesman shop or whatever it is. But it's beyond that, it's not really a lot. And so what I think is interesting about that is, even though the hobbits aren't abjectly poor, they don't have a lot of stuff. they do enjoy giving gifts and knickknacks and things like that, but they don't seem to be just acquisitive for the sake of acquisitiveness. And for that reason, most of what they do have is of pretty significant importance. What they can lose is the kinds of things that you would never want to lose. It would be one thing to lose half of your bank account if your bank account was, rather large. But if you lost your home, even if you had insurance to pay for another one, that could be a significant psychological blow, because the home you live in has a lot to do with your emotional and mental well-being. It's something that you're attached to, and something you can even love, in a sense, not love in the sense of loving another person, but it's something that you can be really attached to. And similarly, and this kind of connects actually to a statement that Merry makes after the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. He's talking to Pippin about the fact that they've kind of lived among the heights, which is unusual for a hobbit, but they can't do it very long. And he says that it's best to love first that which you're fitted to love, and the roots of the Shire go deep. And I think this is really kind of getting at some of the same ideas here. It's the idea that Merry and Pippin have been off on this really grand adventure, and they have come to know things which they never would have known if they had stayed in the Shire, which they can now love in a kind of remote sense. They love Aragorn on a personal level because they've grown very fond of him as a friend. But as the story goes on and Aragorn starts moving more and more into his king role and less into the role of Strider, even that becomes slightly more remote for the hobbits, because the hobbits are in a position of they're not really even fully aware of everything that's going on in the kingdom of Gondor and all that. Pippin gets a much more up-close look. Merry gets more of an up-close look at Theoden and whatnot. And even in Merry's case, that's kind of different, because Theoden is not a very kingly person in the way that Denethor might be, because he's very much a grandfatherly old, teddy bear almost, in some sense, to Merry. So you've got all this idea of Merry talking about loving what you're supposed to love, which is where they grew up, where they have their roots, where they have, things that belong to them and that are really associated to them. So while the hobbits can learn to appreciate the things that they didn't know before, like Aragorn and Gandalf and, Gandalf's true nature and that sort of thing, they're never going to love them the way that they love the things of the Shire. So here I think is the real root of why the Shire hobbits don't seem to be affected as much by the Nazgul. The Nazgul's fear is a very spiritual fear. It's almost like a fear of nothing, just an abject terror, desperation. It's not necessarily a fear of losing anything or being harmed or anything like that. And I think this is important because the hobbits, what do they have to fear? The main thing they have to fear, because of their simple livelihoods, is the loss of their home, the loss of their family, their community, and that sort of thing. And it's not so much here that I'm thinking in terms of, well, if you lose that, the hobbits are afraid of losing that, and therefore they're willing to stand up for it. Because we'll see in the Scouring the Shire that in a way they kind of give those things up relatively easy just from being complacent. And, Saruman is basically able to run the Shire, and the hobbits just kind of go along to get along. You could say, in a sense, of fearing to lose things that they don't want to lose, like their homes and their families. But I don't think that's even so much fear versus courage as it is just they don't have what it takes to just fight. It's not natural to hobbits. But that's why I think in the end it only takes Frodo, Merry, Sam, and Pippin coming back and really sparking something to really get a resistance going. There were hobbits who resisted before, but very few, and the rest just kind of went along, because it's rare to find a hobbit who's going to do that. So what I think is going on here is the hobbits have a courage that is founded at a very deep level, at the level of the things that I have to defend are the things that I love the most. And so when it comes to it, when they're really pushed to it, they have that deep seed of courage that Gandalf refers to that can be wakened and really brought to fruition relatively easily. And that's why in the Scouring of the Shire we see so many hobbits suddenly leaping to the defense of their home and really pushing for it. And I think this is why they're not as affected by the Nazgul, because in their own ground, in their own communities, in their own homes, they are on the position of being where they have what they love, and that is where their courage comes from. So I think what's going on here is the hobbits are quite literally standing on the things that give them courage. It's their land, it's their homes are at their back, their families are around them. They don't really have as much reason to fear because they have very little to lose. And the things that they do have to lose, it's not like they're expecting to lose anything to the Nazgul, but that's kind of the point. A lot of other people might be more afraid to lose things that are not as important because they have more things that are not as important. Whereas, they can be more, people in other circumstances, in other words, could be made to fear things in a spiritual kind of way like the Nazgul do because they can be afraid of nothing. Whereas the hobbits don't have much reason to be afraid of things unless it's really a significant threat to something concrete. And so the hobbits are, in the Shire at least, they're in that world. They're already in the world of what they have. And so what do they have to be afraid of? And so the fear that the Nazgul cause is not going to be as effective. And I think that is the power of the Shire that Gandalf is talking about. And that's why the hobbits can really stand up to the Nazgul in the Shire as well as they do, whereas almost everywhere else we see the Nazgul basically overrun people with fear. So that's my video on the courage of the hobbits and why in the Shire they can stand up to the Nazgul even though nobody else seems to be able to do that. Hope you enjoyed it, and of course, because this is another collaboration with the other Tolkien YouTubers, there will be a link in the description below for the giant playlist of other videos that they're doing on similar topics, so do check those out as well. If you want to follow me over at Twitter, you can do that at JRRTLore, and occasionally I drop some Tolkien-related trivia questions there. If you enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. Please also subscribe and hit that bell icon for notifications. You can also find me on Rumble now, and you can support me over on Patreon. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore Channel. Namarie.